Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of One Shot Reviews. So this month I reviewed a movie called Cemetery Man on my Year of the Demons review series. This is a movie that was based on a comic book by Tiziano Sclavi, where a character named Cemetery Man shows up for a few issues in the main comic book series called Dylan Dog. So even though this movie I'm about to review has nothing to do with demons, I thought it'd be a kind of nice companion piece to end out the year. And the movie is called Dylan Dog Dead of Night. This is based on the actual comic book by Tiziano Sclavi that Cemetery Man came from. However, it has nothing to do with Cemetery Man. It is based solely on the Dylan Dog character. It was released in 2011, and it was a pretty big flop. I believe it was made for like 20 million, not counting any marketing, and it made like 5.5-ish million, which is pretty significant loss for the company. My biggest problem with this movie is that it's uneventful and it doesn't really have a lasting taste that gets you want to talk about it. I have nothing personally against this movie. I think it was competently made, but I really don't have a lot to say about it. So let's get to what I actually want to talk about with this movie, which is kind of like the comic it's based on. The actual comic book series has been very long running, and it was in Italy, where it was very famous there, but it only had like limited success elsewhere. So the idea of taking Dylan Dog and putting it into a movie that was like made in America and had American sensibilities was already kind of a tough task to tackle. It's kind of like a fun alliteration right there. Tough task to tackle. Anyways, the character of Dylan Dog is a paranormal investigator who kind of like goes around and tries to solve crimes that involve anything paranormal. So this can involve werewolves, vampires, zombies, and just a plethora of other weird and unsettling creatures that can go bump in the night. In this movie, he is sort of that, but he's retired. Because of a falling out he had with the vampires and kind of the whole paranormal community at large, he decided to become just a normal investigator, so he like finds people cheating and whatnot. So he's just kind of like a PI. The story is also an original idea, which on the surface sounds like, oh, why would they take an original idea when there's all of this comic book arcs that they could choose from? And looking at it from now, like with all these other comic book centered movies that we have out, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, because a lot of these movies take the character from these comic books and kind of put them in their own story that's kind of like a hodgepodge of ideas and concepts from the comics. I think that's kind of like what they did here. Again, they did do it in its own original way. I'm not sure if the character of Dylan Dog ever retired because of something like this, but they take ideas from the comics with the kind of creatures that he interacts with and whatnot, and it's its own idea, which I don't think on the surface is a bad idea. However, for the sake of this adaptation, I want to say it was. And I'll get to why I think that's important after we go over just like a brief synopsis of the story. So Dylan Dog Dead of Night. It stars Brandon Routh, let's go with Routh. And you probably know him. He played Superman in Superman Returns, and if you're more of a die-hard comic book fan, he played the Atom on the Arrowverse. In this, he is the character of Dylan Dog, and he has an assistant played by Sam Huntington, who's kind of like the surrogate for us. He doesn't know about this paranormal stuff, so he's kind of our beeline into getting exposition thrown at us to figure out like, oh, this is what the world of the paranormal is like. And on the surface, he is pretty good comic relief. I actually was chuckling at a few things he was doing and saying. He eventually becomes a zombie very early on. That's not too much of a spoiler. So it's also him just kind of like experiencing what it's like to be thrown into this insane world. What the story involves is an art collector who also kind of dabbles in like finding paranormal objects and a bit of like a shady side of finding these antiquities. He is killed by a werewolf, so his daughter enlists the PI Dylan Dog in hopes that he will come back to be like a paranormal investigator. From there, they kind of find this whole giant, convoluted legend and werewolves and vampires and a little bit of the zombies as well. They're all coming together in this kind of convoluted story that I don't really want to go into the depths of each like beat of the plot, because it really just consists of like them going somewhere, finding out that they need to track someone else down, and then going to somewhere else. Then now we got to find this artifact, and then we got to save this artifact from someone else, and then I got to kill the big bad guy at the end who had no character development, and that's Dylan Dog. So the problem, I think, with this story is that, again, they wanted to go as an original idea so they could shape it in its own like American audience sensibilities. Like they kind of Hollywoodified it, which on the surface is the right move to do, because you're taking this very obscure comic book character from Italy that no one's heard of, and you're trying to make a movie that people will go see. Now again, original ideas sometimes flounder when it comes to Hollywood, but it is essentially sounds like an original idea because no one else really knows about it. However, they go and make it like the most bland police procedural thing that you could really go with, and even though there are some good bits, Peter Stormare plays a werewolf in a not quite like bad guy role, which I think is pretty unique because typically he is kind of like the bad guy. And Taye Diggs plays a vampire that's high up in this kind of like originals Vampire Diaries society. I kind of get vibes of like the upper echelon people in Blade that like Stephen Dorff plays. It's kind of like he's a cool club owner, but he's also like a ruthless vampire, and just gonna get that kind of vibe from him. He's, again, very good acting. Brandon Routh, on the other hand, is wooden at times, and everything else is not like quite noteworthy, I would say, and that's where the movie really falls. It's just a kind of bland movie that they try to boil down this really in-depth comic book to something that was just more palpable to the audience, and ultimately it's like, hey, we've seen this before, we don't want to see it again. And it's not a particularly great movie. It's not bad, but it's not really memorable. What they should have done, since this movie flopped anyways, is really embrace the themes and the darkness from the Dylan Dog comic books, along with the wacky ideas that it comes with, and make a pretty much a cult film. Now, you don't go out and try to make a cult film, but if they would have just embraced all these sensibilities from the Italian comic book, it probably would have flopped just as badly. Maybe it would have done better, but ultimately would have had a better lasting impact and would have eventually became a cult film if they like embraced it and just really just went for broke. And for all we know, maybe that would have been the better angle they could have went with. So I see why they wanted to make it a Hollywood movie. On paper, it's the right move, but in hindsight, they couldn't have been any worse off in the moment for going, like, really embracing the source material. And if they did do that, I think I would be wanting to talk about this movie more. Like, it could have been very similar to Cemetery Man in a way, but they just kind of went for this very generic feel to it that it felt like I've seen it before. It's like, oh, I've seen Underworld, I don't want to see this now. And that's kind of all I gotta say about Dylan Dog. It doesn't have like a lot of oomph behind it, unfortunately, and it was entertaining to an extent. The effects were good to an extent. It was a mediocre movie, unfortunately. So I hope you guys all have a great Christmas. I kind of wanted to do a Christmas-themed movie for my one-shot reviews, but at the same time I kind of wanted to get this out to compare it to Cemetery Man, which ultimately there's not much comparison I can do besides saying Cemetery Man good, Dylan Dog bad. Merry Christmas.